All right. So, Alex, how long has it been since you've seen Oh Lucky Man?
20 years at least since I saw Lucky Man.
And,
At least 20 years, so that would be what, the early 80s or something like that.
right. And
Or the early 90s.
so what were some of the highlights for you watching it again?
The whole film is the highlight because it is so strong and it is so solid. It is so lacking in failings. I mean, it really, really succeeds. I mean, even if you don't agree with what the director's trying to do,
Well,
he
but
certainly succeeds
though it succeeds in what specifically?
in a cohesive vision of capitalism, of the Western world, of the divide in Britain between the North and South of England.
And could you clarify the divide between North and South? Because at one point while we were watching the film, you said that for Anderson, London was heaven and the North was hell,
The
right?
film begins in the south of England, and McDowell is sent to the north of England, which is for anybody from London or for anybody like Anderson from the patrician class, is a hell world of corruption and Masonic porno bars and all the rest of it. I come from that world, and that is true. That is what it's like.
Well, if you're saying it's true, then could you clarify the Masonic porno bars? Because
London is 3 times worse. And that's the funny thing, is because McDowell was from Liverpool. I am from Liverpool. When we worked with Anderson, we played along with this game that in some way the north of England is the source of all vices. You see the same thing in Get Carter or in Jack Gould's film, The Reckoning. These are all great films, but they all have in their heart the idea that corruption, is personified in the north of England. But I think what Anderson does really well is he says in this film, it may be personified and visible in the north of England, but its home is the south. And that was what is so funny about the end of it and about how McDowell really gets in trouble when he goes back home. He really gets in trouble when he goes back to London, because that's where evil really resides. We are only minimally evil compared to the vices of the city of London, whereas McDowell says in the film, they make £1 trillion a day.
now, actually, could you tie in 2 concepts: the Warner Brothers, Warner name, and the building?
Yeah. Well, there's a couple of interesting, there's many interesting references in the film to England at that time. One is to this tower block, Centrepoint, which was constructed during the Labour government of Harold Wilson. Harold Wilson was from the north of England. He was the head boy at my school. We were all grammar school in the north of England. But he did involve himself with a number of corrupt entities, and he did permit the construction of this ginormous tower block, Centrepoint, this black monolith, rather like the 2001 monolith, which the film features. Of course, now London is full of those monstrosities. What was the other thing?
Warner's.
Warner's! And the other thing, which is kind of unfair of Lindsay, is at this time Warner Brothers were very big on putting money into British films. Not fake British films like James Bond or Harry Potter, but real British films like A Clockwork Orange or A Lucky Man. And in the same way as there's so many overlaps between this film and A Clockwork Orange, one of them is the presence of Warner Brothers as the financier. And I think the thing is with Anderson, more than Kubrick, who was actually grateful to the studio for giving him the money for A Clockwork Orange, Anderson, the patrician Englishman, the fake Buddhist, Anderson would be the guy who would mock the studio, who were giving him the money to make this film. And that's why the chauffeur is named Warner. It's Anderson dissing in a peculiarly patrician, ungrateful, and ultimately unproductive way his relationship with Warner Brothers, the financier.
And I feel like there was something else, but it's escaping me right now. But I wanted to ask you about the movie.
Well, one thing about the movie is the way the multiple characters are played by the same actor. that you see Arthur Lowe, who was a great British television actor, playing his boss, and then the corrupt mayor up north, and then finally the African president.
What was up with the blackface?
Totally outrageous, isn't it? Totally outrageous
Yeah.
to have a white actor play a black man in blackface. But Anderson's just saying, fuck you, I mean, in a sense, he had his own ideas, he had his own notions.
Who's he saying fuck you to?
He's saying, I think Anderson's saying no to political correctness.
Okay.
I would never do a thing like that. But Anderson, coming from a higher status in society, felt that was bullshit. And if he wanted to, he could have a white actor play a black guy.
This was
rather like we see later in Tropic Thunder.
Right. And actually, when in terms of like having multiple characters, you made an interesting comment about Malik, and I couldn't help but think of Dr. Strangelove, of course, with Peter Sellers playing multiple roles, and I also couldn't help but feel that this was the kind of movie that Terry Southern might have somehow been involved in.
I guess the author of this script, David Sherwin, probably kind of is the English Terry Southern, isn't he?
Oh, really?
He never really got much credit. I mean, he worked for Lindsay Anderson. He wrote several scripts for Lindsay Anderson. Some weren't produced. But I mean, he was a fine screenwriter and a fine writer, and to a certain extent, he always kind of got left behind because the credit was always given to the auteur, the director, and never to the screenwriter. Even though in the case of Sherwin, like Southern, often the screenwriter's contribution is super important.
Although in this case, it was Malcolm McDowell's idea, right? And then do you know anything, do you have any, because you've dealt with McDowell, did you actually talk to him personally about this at any point, or?
I was involved with McDowell and Alan Price, who wrote the music for this film, because Lindsay Anderson was going to direct a script that I wrote called Scousers. And so.
And what year was that again?
This was back in '89. No, it was back
No,
in
70s?
79. It was way back in
79.
In the late 70s, early 80s. Lindsay Anderson was going to direct this script that I'd written called Scousers.
And tell me again what the premise of the script was.
The premise of the film is that some guys who aspired to be rock and rollers but never could ended up robbing the payroll at a local oil refinery in order to fund their rock and roll activities.
Got it.
That's a tragedy. Anderson wanted to direct it, and so he put me in touch with McDowell and also with Alan Price, because he wanted McDowell and Alan Price to play two of the main characters.
And how was that meeting?
Oh, it was great. I mean, my experiences with Anderson were great. My experiences with McDowell and Price were great. I thought they were all wonderful people.
Where was this?
Santa Monica, California.
Aha. Now, and again, to get back to McDowell's, did you actually talk to him about this movie at all, or
Yeah, well, we talked about it in terms of how much we loved it.
And I know that it's Malcolm McDowell's favorite, I think, of the movies he starred in. He claims it's one of his favorite. Autobiographical, somehow?
I don't know. I mean, I think the original idea was his because they'd come out of IF, and McDowell was very young when they did IF. He was in his early 20s, I think. And so McDowell had this idea that they would do a film, The Subsequent Adventures of Travis, and it was going to be called Coffee Man, and somehow that got turned into David Sherman's script and Lindsay Anderson's film, Lucky Man. But it was definitely a joint effort.
A joint.